I've been a remote or hybrid or flexible or a combination of the three worker for almost the last 20 years. And the most fascinating thing about that experience is not once in those nearly 20 years did I ever feel that somebody wouldn't trust me to do my job simply because I was remote. We have to learn to be critical of ourselves to understand what it takes for someone to truly break our trust. I made a mistake. Trust me that I will learn from it. Trusting people means putting your trust in the right place. We've been assuming that trust and knowledge are separate, that trust is a fixed amount while knowledge will continue to grow, when in fact, these two things are intangibly linked. So trust is measurable, but it relies on rational judgment. Ownership about the real reasons why you're choosing not to delegate needs to happen. Trust isn't a power game, it's a mutual experience. Hey, welcome to the Leaders Podcast with me, Laura McDonald, the leadership coach and mentor. Come with me as I explore the elements of leadership that give leaders like you the power and confidence to make the impact you know you can. I'll be sharing my own experiences, top tips and insights, and talking to some very special guests to share their thoughts and leadership experiences on mindset, influence, change, and growth. So let's get right to it. How much do you really trust other people? I'm asking because in the last few years, trust has been a really big conversation. These days, there is barely a day I can scroll through things like LinkedIn and not see a post about whether managers or leaders trust their staff. One of the biggest triggers for this uplifting conversation around trust was the introduction of mass hybrid remote and flexible working when COVID happened. And slowly but surely, we're seeing company after company require their staff to come back to the office, or they may lose their jobs. To be honest, this was one of the most baffling conversations I've seen in my career, because I've been a remote or hybrid or flexible or a combination of the three worker for almost the last 20 years. Remote and hybrid working was not a new thing. It's been around for decades, and the companies I've worked for have relied on remote and hybrid working across their structures for the entire time of their existence. And the most fascinating thing about that experience is not once in those nearly 20 years did I ever feel that somebody wouldn't trust me to do my job simply because I was remote. It is understandable that a lot of companies during COVID put rushed systems into place to track staff activity because this was the first time they'd had to do this. This was a massive change in a hugely critical situation, and all that mattered was saving the business. And I completely understand that. So you put in place whatever you had time to put in place. But what that resulted in was a huge amount of micromanagement, constant battles around how much employees felt they were trusted, and eventually led to what was termed the Great Resignation. And I suppose in a lot of leaders' minds it's this whole seeing is believing thing. If you can see someone sat in the office physically doing their work, you trust that they're doing their job. But I was fascinated to know what those leaders thought was the evidence for them to not trust the people that were sat at home. And I have to say, one of the funniest conversations I saw in 2020-21 was this whole thing of my staff are going to be sat at home around in their pajamas. Well, one of the first major meetings that we had as a region when I was on furlough was with our operations managers, our area managers, and pretty much the entire senior management team was sat in their pajamas on that call. Now, I'd purposely got dressed and put some proper clothes on. My senior leaders were sat there in their pajamas. Did it mean they weren't doing their jobs? Absolutely not. So it was fascinating to me that leaders in other places started saying that they couldn't trust their staff not to sit around in their pajamas. And in too many places still, there's a lack of recognition of that bias towards people that come to the office. A lot of companies are finding that hybrid working is working as a really good model that serves them well, that's allowing people to be productive. But too many companies, too many leaders are still talking about how they can't trust people to work at home. Another area where trust is a big conversation, which we saw well before COVID, was delegation. A lot of the time, leaders don't hand over tasks because of a supposed lack of trust. And in the past, I've heard phrases like, I can't trust them to do their own job, let alone mine. Or if you want something doing well, do it yourself. But think about the damage that statements like that cause. Any good leader requires trust and respect to be successful, and that is a two-way street. When you use statements like, I couldn't trust them to do their own job, let alone mine, or if you want something doing well, do it yourself, all you're showing is that you don't trust your staff. But in reality, it's not that you don't trust someone, it's that you've got some sort of other issue going on with your own mindset, potentially imposter syndrome, worried about being found out about not being good enough with your job, worried about not seeming productive enough with your time. And sometimes it's as simple as, I don't want somebody to do it differently from me, even if the result is just as good. It's this need in our head to be right. When I worked in the kitchens, I could expect to work with anything up to 10 people in the room. And with the volume of sales that were happening and how quickly tables got turned over, there was absolutely no way that I could run that whole kitchen by myself all day, every day. There is no way that I could take other tasks off other people's hands. I had to trust the other 10 people in the kitchen that they knew what they were doing. Okay, they might not follow the same path I took round the kitchen. They might not put everything in the same order that I put everything in. But you know what? The dish came out exactly the same, company standard. I started by training them on processes that they could follow, but these were all my ways of doing things. If they found a better way of doing it that worked better for them, I was happy for them to take it on. I trusted my team to produce that dish, even when I wasn't there. I couldn't do other people's jobs for them, even if I wanted to. It was all about making everybody else more capable and the more independent of me, and the more independent of me they could be, the easier it was for me to develop internal leadership teams that would take over from me when I left, rather than having another external manager come in and start again. And we've all heard different versions of the phrase trust takes a lifetime to build and a moment to break. But sometimes we have to learn to be critical of ourselves to understand what it takes for someone to truly break our trust. So let me give you an example of this. Yesterday, I was speaking to a client about the performance management process, and like so many others, she was under the impression that performance management essentially was a process by which people who are underperforming go through a meeting or some sort of formal procedure that gives them consequences for underperformance. But that's not the purpose of performance management. Performance management is there to retain people within the organization and help them get better. The only time you should ever reach a decision to let somebody go and terminate their employment is either when a gross misconduct offence has been committed and proven, when you can categorically say that you've done everything in your power to support that person, to retain them in the business, and the only conclusion that remains is simply that this job is not right for them. But I have seen it in a lot of leaders I work with, and I will fully admit that I myself as a leader have done this previously, is the second somebody goes into the performance management process, the formal performance management process, I found myself questioning how much I trusted that person. But then I reminded myself of what happened when I was that entry-level staff member who made some silly mistakes. It wasn't intended to cause harm. Sometimes I didn't realise that I was making an error, and I wasn't doing it to piss anyone off. And yes, there were consequences, things like performance action plans or performance improvement plans, whatever you want to call them. I did find certain leaders within the business starting to look at me, wondering whether they could trust me, simply because I'd had a performance improvement plan. And to me, that wasn't a good enough reason. I made a mistake. Trust me that I will learn from it. So when I found myself questioning my own trust in my entry-level staff members who were going through some sort of formal performance management procedure, I looked back to my own experience and asked myself, how would I have wanted to be treated in that moment? And that's how I treated my staff. I trusted that they would learn from the experience, and if they didn't, I would find a way to help them do exactly that. Trusting people means putting your trust in the right place. Trusting that people are capable of and want to learn and grow, especially from their failures and mistakes. But half of that comes from your attitude. If your attitude towards mistakes and failure is they're a terrible thing, they should never happen, we shouldn't be letting that reoccur, it shouldn't be done ever, you should know better than that, then of course your team members will view mistakes and failures as terrible things, mistakes that happened that they've been reprimanded for and should never happen again. They become fearful of them rather than seeing them as a learning opportunity. You know what? I look back on all of the mistakes I made as an entry-level team member and think, thank God I learned that. Because without those mistakes, without those failures, I wouldn't have seen the benefit of growth. I wouldn't have understood things like professional conduct. I wouldn't have understood things like teamwork, and yes, trust and mutual respect. I wouldn't have understood those things if I hadn't made the mistakes that threatened to break those things in the first place. And for every mistake I made, I can tell you now, I never did it again. But that personal growth only happened not because of the leaders that were now questioning their trust in me, but because of the leaders at the top who were actually dealing with my performance management. They showed me very firmly and very quickly that yes, we don't want this happening again. This is important, but the point is that you learn from it. You see, failure isn't separate from success. It is, in fact, the path to it. When I work with leadership groups, I often ask them to define what trusting someone 100% means. And it's usually followed by quite a large discussion, often with a few conflicting opinions, and it normally ends in agreeing to disagree. But I'm sure many of you out there can recall being sent home with your laptop in lockdown and suddenly feeling like your leaders couldn't trust you. It's possible that your leaders taught you never to trust anyone 100%. Even if you disagreed, it's probably impacted your leadership somehow that your leader told you you should never do that. So here's what I think trust is. If you have a partner or a best friend or whoever that most valuable person is in your life, you'd probably say you trust them most. You may even say that you trust them 100%, right? So what if you could say that about your colleagues? What if it's not that you trust your partner or your best friend more than other people? What if it is that you just know more about them? We've been assuming that trust and knowledge are separate, that trust is a fixed amount while knowledge will continue to grow or shrink, whatever happens to it. When in fact, these two things are intangibly linked. They both start small. You start with a little bit of knowledge, and that knowledge grows over time, and the trust grows alongside it. Their ranges grow together over time as you discover more about that person. So if what you do know about someone is trustworthy and they've shown no evidence to the contrary, you can trust 100% of what you know. It's not naivety, it's going with the evidence. So if I was to put this into a visual representation for you in your mind, think about meeting a person for the first time. You, in that first meeting, probably learn an inch of knowledge about them. Well, if what you know in that inch is trustworthy, then I trust them 100%, as in an inch, because that's how much I know about them. I trust 100% of what I know about them. If then after the second meeting you now know 3 inches about them, well, your trust should have grown to 3 inches as well, and so on and so forth, and it keeps growing over time. When you have a team member that then does something that puts them in the first stages of performance management, for example, getting a performance action plan, that's not a reason to write them off. That's not a reason to say, I can't trust them anymore. You have to quantify how much trust they've lost. For example, somebody makes a silly communication error with a client. They've probably lost 10% of your trust, okay? But they've still got 90% of your trust. They've just lost the 10% that's surrounded by you know how to communicate with clients, you know what professional behavior is. That's 10%, not all of the trust. So your job as their leader is to not just start that performance management process and hope that the consequences will make them learn through fear of it happening again. Your job as the leader is to help them regain that 10% of trust. Your job is to rise them up, not push them down. And the most critical part of this is abandoning any assumptions you have about what they were thinking or feeling when they acted. You don't know what somebody else is feeling. You don't know what somebody else was thinking. And half the time, they weren't thinking. It's also important to remember what it is that happened, a mistake, not a malicious act, not something spiteful or begrudging of somebody else. It was a mistake, an error in judgment, a blunder, something we've all done at some point. Going back to the hybrid and remote working thing again for a minute, some people actually do prefer to be in the office, and this is why I say hybrid and remote should be offered as options. If you've got the ability to have people in the office, then offer that too, because some people will prefer to be there every day of the week. But where somebody says they want to work remotely or hybrid, and actually they're struggling to do that, they're struggling to be productive at home, it might be the case that you pull them into the office temporarily on the basis that, yes, they've lost that 10% of trust around being productive at home. But you've pulled them into the office not so that you can chain them to the desk permanently. You've brought them into the office to help them understand the tools, techniques, structures, processes that they can put in place for themselves at home to help them be productive. The end goal should be to be able to send them home again. So trust is measurable, but it relies on rational judgment for us to use it effectively. If somebody's lost 10% of trust around productivity at home, but the 10% that tells you that they have good intentions and want to be a good member of the team is still there, use that to help them build back the 10% they lost. Like I said, though, trust is a two-way street, and this is why it's so important for you to start off on the right foot with every single team member. And that right foot is trust them first. Until you have evidence that somebody is untrustworthy, trust them first. But the thing that needs to run alongside of that is authentic leadership. And by that I mean presenting an authentic representation of who you are and why you are trustworthy. Because no job title ever makes you more or less trustworthy than any other person standing in front of you. Authentic leadership is needed to show your staff that they can trust you as much as you should be trusting them. So this is another reason among the many that have already been discussed along the episodes in this podcast that self-awareness is so important to build, because it makes you aware about the biases you have about yourself, the language you use and the statements you make about yourself to yourself and other people. It makes you aware of the image you present and how you're seen versus how you want to be seen. And actions will always speak far louder than words. So if you've got your team advocating for the fact that you do actually follow through on your promises and you do treat everybody with trust and mutual respect, new people in your team are much more likely, far quicker, to buy into the idea of trusting you. Trust isn't a power game, it's a mutual experience. It should be used to empower each other rather than intimidate each other. One of the biggest things you aim to achieve as a leader is influence. And the more influence you have, the more valuable your opinion is to others. And your opinion is only valuable to others when they trust you. There's several leadership styles out there that rely heavily on this too. For example, autocratic leadership, which is in some industries the overarching leadership style. It requires a highly instructional approach to leadership, but it should be done while motivating your team to follow you. Not because you told them to, but because they want to. It relies heavily on the team trusting that you know the direction they should be heading and that it's the right one for them. Your ability to execute certain skills like coaching also heavily rely on your ability to develop trust with other people. If people don't trust that you have the expertise or the willingness to help them get better, there's no reason for them to trust you to coach them. Same with mentoring, same with training. People need trust that the person developing them has all the knowledge, skills, and behaviours to get them to the best level of performance they can reach. One of the most effective ways to build trust in your team is to build a culture of transparency. And like most other things in leadership, once again, this starts with you. Simple actions like being transparent about how you're using your time, anything you're struggling with that perhaps other people can help you with, utilising others who hold strengths that you don't possess, are all great ways to show your team we're going to have the whole conversation rather than just the good bit. It builds the authentic image of you as a leader, which builds others' trust in your knowledge, skills, and behaviours, and your leadership. But the second thing it's going to do is create a ripple effect. encouraging your team to do exactly the same thing. So when they need help, they're going to ask other people. When they've made a mistake, they're going to tell other people. When they've got something to celebrate, they're going to share it with you and ask you to celebrate with them. Most importantly, they'll trust that you will do all of those things. Your peers, your managers, people way higher than you are going to start to see that you follow through on your word, that you are the leader you say you are, because your team is backing that up. When they're asked, they'll tell the truth about your leadership and they'll tell the person asking exactly what's happening. Now, of course, there are limits to transparency. For example, confidential conversations need to be kept confidential, but that in itself builds trust. When they then tell you something in confidence, knowing you will only give it to the people that need to know that information, they will trust more and more that they can talk to you about anything. One key element to this, though, is remembering that you're not always the right person for someone to talk to. Make the goal that others trust you 100%, even if they don't come to you. And don't take it personally when they don't. I'd rather someone went to the right person than just come to me every time, for a couple of reasons, really. The first is that I'm not always the most expert person in whatever they're asking about. If someone else is better equipped to teach someone something or to help them solve a problem they're having, I'd rather they went to that person than come to me. Secondly, if everything is coming to me all the time, that's an awful lot of pressure on my shoulders, and I've been there. It's hard work. I don't want to be the person that the team comes to for absolutely everything. I would rather be in the position that if something ends up on my desk, it's because either I'm the expert or everyone else has tried to solve it and now they need my help. Which brings me to the next key thing you can do to build trust in teams: develop them. One key point I raise with a lot of training groups is that progression doesn't have to mean promotion. You can't just promote everybody in an organisation, there's not enough room, and not everybody wants to be promoted either, but everybody should be progressing. Skills and knowledge should constantly be built, collaboration with others should be increasing, creativity and innovation should constantly be in use, and here's the key one: delegation should be happening daily. If you've listened to my previous episode on time management, you'll know that a key tool to delegation and understanding what you can delegate is the Eisenhower Matrix priority tool. But even if you're really clear on what it is you need to delegate, you don't always necessarily make the decision to do so, and there's a few reasons behind that. For example, you could be under the illusion that you have to keep everything within your control, do it your way, because you know that it works, you know that it's right, and you're not likely to suffer consequences of work done wrong if you're not handing it over. One I hear quite a lot is, I don't want to bother anyone, they're so busy. But if you're developing others to manage their time well, then they shouldn't be so busy that they won't want to take on a little bit of extra responsibility to grow. But whatever the reason behind you deciding not to delegate, the one thing you should avoid doing at all costs is mask the true reason with a supposed lack of trust. Ownership about the real reasons why you're choosing not to delegate needs to happen. Own those reasons, understand them, work through them to overcome them. The goal still needs to be for you to be able to delegate to your team. You can develop your team in lots of other ways as well. For example, in episode 4, Listening is Your Most Powerful Tool, I described how you can use listening to understand your team's motivations, which significantly enhances your leadership effectiveness and ability to motivate them. An example I always use from this was actually when I was in hospitality. Very few people actually saw hospitality as a long-term career. So it was my job to find out exactly what it was that they wanted to do with their life. They may not have a specific career in mind. They may not have, a specific job title in mind. But what they do have every day is a growing knowledge of what they want to do with their work. Do they want to help people? Do they want to work with computers? Do they want to work with their hands? Do they want to do a practical job? Do they want to do a desk job? Do they want to answer phones? Do they want to work on projects? Do they like long-term things or short-term things? What is it that they want to do? And by finding those things out, I can start tailoring development towards their goals. All this is doing is building trust in the background. It's helping people trust you that you've got their best interests at heart. But along that journey, again, display transparency, be honest with them about exactly what it is they need to do, what actions they need to take, how much ownership they need to hold to reach their goals. And that trust will only grow because now they don't just trust that you have their best interests at heart, they also trust that you're telling them the truth. Trust really is a fragile thing. We have to be careful with it. It takes time to build, it takes time to solidify, and even when it's solidified, it still has the potential to break. The pivotal moment for any trusting relationship is how you both go into it, because you only get back what you put in. If you start a conversation with a brand new person, skeptical and unwilling to trust, that's exactly what you'll get back. Change that mindset to go into every conversation with every person, starting off with trust, starting off with belief in the other person, starting off with the mindset that when it comes to trust, you're both equal. It's a level playing field, and no job title is ever going to make you more or less trustworthy than any person standing in front of you. Treat trust as part of humanity rather than hierarchy. Then jump off the cliff edge. Take the risk to give trust, knowing you'll get it back. Until next time, everyone.